Good morning from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us for today's AI Governance Series program from wherever around the globe you might be, including some of our speakers today. I'm Natalie Roisman. I recently joined the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy here at Georgetown Law as Executive Director, and I'm looking forward to meeting many of you in the coming months. It's our pleasure at the Tech Institute to be co-hosting this series and today's program with the Wikimedia Yale Initiative on Intermediaries and Information at the Yale Law School Information Society Project, together with the Georgetown Global TechNet Working Group. We're honored to be joined today by Professor Suresh Venkatasubramanian, who will discuss the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights released by the White House this fall. Before we begin, I want to take a brief moment to thank the Wikimedia Yale Initiative for our continuing partnership and to express appreciation to Kyoko Yoshinaga, non-resident senior fellow here at the Tech Institute, for her ongoing efforts to support this series, and in particular for helping me to get up to speed in my first few weeks here. And with that, I'll turn things over to Mehtab Khan, who's director of the Wikimedia Initiative at the Yale ISP and our moderator today. Mehtab?
Thank you so much, Natalie. It's a great pleasure to be hosting this event with Georgetown Law. And I am Mehtab. I am the program director of the Wikimedia Initiative at the Yale Information Society Project. We're really excited today to have our speaker with us today, Suresh Venkatasubramanian, who is a professor of computer science and data science at Brown University. His background is in algorithms and computational geometry, as well as data mining and machine learning. And his current research interests lie in algorithmic fairness and more generally, the impact of automated decision-making systems in society. And today, what we'll be talking about is the recent project that Suresh finished when he served as the Assistant Director for Science and Justice in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and helped co-write the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. So we'll hear from Suresh first, and then we have our panelists today who will be joining in with questions and comments. So first we have Nikolas Guggenberger, who is an assistant professor of law at the University of Houston Law Center. And his work focuses on antitrust, law and technology, privacy and regulation. We have Anupam Chander, who is an expert on the global regulation of new technologies, as well as a professor of law at Georgetown Law. And then we have Artur Pericles, who is the Wikimedia Fellow at the Information Society Project, and his work focuses on platform governance and freedom of speech. So without further delay, Suresh, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mehtab, and thank you to all of you at the Georgetown Institute for inviting me to be here today. I will now share my screen. I have a few slides to present here. And let me know if you're able to see that file. Great.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So once again, thank you all for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought I'd start very briefly, since there are many of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, just a brief introduction of myself, and then I can talk more about the blueprint that OSTV put out. And I'm eager to get quickly to the discussion, where I'm sure it will have a lively discussion about what it is and what it can and cannot do. So I've, as Mehtab mentioned, I'm a computer scientist by training. I've spent, many years in academia. I did my PhD at Stanford, spent some time in industrial research labs, and also at Penn, and then went to the University of Utah, where I spent, a good 15 years working in various aspects of computer science. And I think, I started working in this space about 10 odd years ago, when I first started thinking about, broadly speaking, fair machine learning and the issues of discriminatory decision making, and that sort of that aperture expanded out pretty quickly once I started pulling threads and started thinking about these issues, to the point where now there's a lot of questions, broadly speaking, the societal impact of automated decision making that I think about. And along the way, along with my regular academic work, I've spent time in the public sphere. I've worked with the ACLU for a number of years. I was on the board at the ACLU of Utah, as well as working with the national organization on research projects, which to this day, in fact, I've helped advise cities and states on procurement and sort of oversight and governance of AI systems. And of course, all of this happened before I went to work at OSTP. And also at the same time, in fact, moved to Brown. So I'm actually fairly new at Brown as well. So with that sort of context out of the way, maybe I'll spend a few minutes trying to talk about, the document is out there and there's been lots and lots of great commentary about it. So I'm not suspecting I'll say anything here that you haven't thought about or read about in the document itself, but I just like to give from my perspective a little bit of a sense of what the goals were, where OSTP was coming from, and what were important things to achieve. Obviously, one single thing like this is not going to achieve all our goals, but trying to emphasize what goals you were trying to achieve and to the extent to which we achieved them is how I want to set the context for the discussion. So as you probably know, all of this started with the October 2021 op-ed that, Deputy Director Alondra Nelson had co-authored, talking about a need for a Bill of Rights in an AI-powered world, right? And so this is basically it set out the framework for what was to become the blueprint, arguing that, we need protections for people to guard against the misuse and the harms associated with technologies. And I think that framing is important because a lot of discussions around AI and AI governance center around how to foster an innovation landscape and how to encourage a lot of innovative work in AI and make sure some of the harms are mitigated. And the focus here really was to focus on the harms and to focus on protections for people, rather than trying to sort of do what, in my personal view would be sort of a fake balance, I think, between harms and benefits. So that's the context for the op-ed itself and sort of kicked off the entire process. And sort of a rough timeline, this is very, very rough. So I don't think, you should take it too seriously, but after the op-ed, there were a bunch of convenings, public convenings, whose videos you can watch to this day, listening sessions with the public, requests for information on biometrics, lots of information collected through that and analysis done, a lot of feedback just on the email address that was put out from OSTP to get feedback from people, and a lot of emails were received that address. A lot of time spent drafting sort of very initial version of the document, and a very, very long process of interagency feedback, review, edit, commenting, thousands of comments adjudicated and incorporated into the document. So it really was a very much a massive team effort coming out, coordinated by OSTP with a lot of input from inside government, outside government, civil society, industrial partners, the public at large, you name it. And that's what led to the release of the document this past October. So what, you've seen the document itself, and it has 5 principles that guide the design, use, and deployment of automated systems. And if it were just that, it would be maybe 2 pages long or 3 pages long. But of course, it comes with a technical companion, a companion that explains the importance of each principle, sets out expectations for implementation, and gives examples of moving these principles into practice. And this part of the document was very important for us because we wanted to show that what we were asking for or what we were proposing was was important, was linked to direct harms and direct problems, and the listing of why each principle was important laid out specific case studies of where the violation of that principle was leading to problems. So not hypotheticals, but actual examples. And concrete expectations for how this might be implemented. And literally at some point, you'd say, okay, if a developer in a tech company is sitting here thinking how to implement their system in a way that safeguards these principles, how would they do it? Now, of course, we don't have a complete spec that you could literally take and code in right now, but the goal was to provide much more specificity on what kind of checks and balances were important to make sure these principles were upheld. And I think this is where having, many computer scientists in the room, and I was just one of, many of my colleague Cyril Friedler was there and others, was very helpful to sort of anchor this in some degree of specificity, which we thought that many of the articulation of principles in the space were lacking in that level of detail. And another point that I think is important to make, and I'm sure this will come up in discussion, is the issue of scope, right? Yeah, the document, used this word AI, which is a bit of a sort of a sleight of hand, but really what the scope of where the principles cover is any automated system that can meaningfully impact civil rights, liberties, privacy, equal opportunities, and access to resources and services. And this was a very important move to make for us because, number one, And again, I'll throw out my computer scientist card here. I know, and we've seen this, that the definitions of what's considered AI and not has evolved and changed and expanded and contracted, in fact, over the decades. And so that definition, which is often designed tactically for certain entities' agendas, did not feel like the right place to anchor the scope of what this document to do. In our view, impact and where people were being affected was the key point of a concern. And it didn't matter as much which technology was being used to impact people's rights. So whether it's deep learning, whether it's a machine learning, whether it's a reinforcement learning tool, whether it's a spreadsheet that was based on using some machine learning, we knew that there are always going to be ways to get around any specific definition. So the goal is to focus on impact. So as long as there was impact and meaningful impact, there was a need to cover that use within scope. Now the rights themselves are really very, as a computer scientist, again, I want to say intuitive. They're very natural, right? And if you look at sort of the different sets of principles that have been put out across the globe, in fact, you won't find anything that is strikingly different in this set. But there are a couple of interesting sort of points of departure, right? So systems should work, right? That seems like a very basic requirement that any automation that is people facing and impactful should work. And sadly, that often doesn't happen. These systems shouldn't discriminate. There should be reckless use of data without control. And this is where, we might get into this discussion. This is not just about privacy. In fact, it's about something different. It's about data flows and the use of data, because that's where the power of machine learning in particular, but data-driven technologies has been the most in access to data, often out of context. And that's what we were trying to address here. And issues of transparency and clarity, you can't really talk about whether a system is working if you don't even know it's there. And so this idea of sort of a right to notice in some sense, right, that you should know that a system is being used and how it's being used. The idea of explanation is important here. And finally, another principle that, comes up a lot, but doesn't really get articulated clearly is this idea of human consideration, that systems, no matter how well you engineer them, will break. You need fallbacks, you need backups, you need ways to get around them. And often some of the failures that we've seen with the use of automation has been there. Systems that break, they're mostly effective. They're not unsafe, but they do break. And so what do you do in that case? And that's why this notion of human consideration is important. And that's also why it's helpful to think of these principles as working in tandem as a group rather than one at a time, right? The goal is not to say, well, you can hit principle number 1 or 3. The point is they work all together, to use the Swiss cheese analogy we've been using in COVID times of layers of protection. These work together to layer protection so that even if a system has not been properly engineered to be safe and effective because of some testing failures, the idea of human consideration means that there's always a backup option and things like that. So just I want to go into a slightly deeper dive into the anatomy of one of the principles, just to sort of emphasize the structure of the document. And again, this may be something you've seen already. It's just helpful to know how we were trying to lay this out, right? So you have this principle, right? You should not face discrimination by algorithms, and systems should be used and designed in an equitable way with a lot of qualifying language. And the first part I would say is to sort of look at the context, right? So in each of these principles, there's a bit of a context to explain what this means. In this case, what is algorithmic discrimination? And this is something we spend some time actually defining in the early part of the document. So once we have that, the goal is to list out where the vectors of harm and concern are coming from. This is important because the harms manifest in different ways, right? So they're not just one kind of harm. And they often require slightly different treatment and understanding, or the set of tools or set of expectations to protect against harms need to be much more all-encompassing to capture these different directions which harm can appear. So in this case, I think we could list many examples of algorithmic discrimination harms, whether it's bias in loan pricing or hiring tools. In fact, Amazon had pulled that hiring tool biased against women out of circulation, and now there's a leaked memo that came out last week suggesting they may bring it back. So these things are constantly ongoing. Predictive tools for colleges, risk assessments in criminal justice, sentiment analyzers, individual disabilities being flagged during exams. There's a whole set of examples that are listed and are concrete examples from reporting on this topic. And then there's the set of expectations, which is probably the longest part of each principle in the technical companion, right? To articulate at a high level what the goals are of what is expected of these systems and how that can be achieved, right? So if you want to protect the public from discrimination proactively and ongoing, well, you need proactive assessments of equity. You need to make sure data is representative and robust. You need to guard against proxies. You need to make sure there's that accessibility considerations are being taken into account. You need to do disparity assessments, and you have to have ongoing monitoring and mitigation for one thing. And so on, right? And all of these, you need independent evaluation reporting. And this is a theme that comes through the entire document. And so if you go back to the original picture, you start seeing where the rest of the text is coming from. A lot of the expectations are coded in the language of the actual principle right up front, so that, very quickly you can get a sense of what's expected of it. So just when you have to read a long document, it's helpful to have a brief summary somewhere. And finally, one thing that's very important, I think will probably come up in discussion as well, is that there are many examples already of how these principles are being moved into practice. There isn't a single, okay, here is exactly how to do it, but there are many different ways in which it's being done, sometimes through voluntary processes, sometimes through standards making, sometimes through regulation and enforcement actions. The point is that there are many different levers of change. And I know, one question that has come up a lot as well, what is the point of putting out a white paper? What kind of legislative power does that have? It doesn't have legislative power. We're not a legislative body. But this document and the fact that it's a blueprint is the scaffolding for all kinds of policy levers to be activated, whether they're through, again, regulations, through legislation at the state level, at the federal level, at the local level, or even through voluntary action, through standards making. There's a whole bunch of different levers. And I think it's helpful to keep that in mind, that these are the ways in which we're likely to push things forward in the absence of omnibus legislation, which could still happen. So I'll conclude here. I'm looking forward to discussion, and I just want to sort of re-emphasize or emphasize some underlying themes, right? That reporting is a key factor, that it is not enough to ask entities to do certain things. We need to make sure that they've done them, and the reporting is part of that. These are not, reporting is not an easy thing. There are challenges associated with it, but it's something that needs to happen. A focus on harms to communities as well as individuals. This is particularly important because many of the harms aggregate at the community level. And if you're asking individuals, for example, to apply for redress, sometimes it's very hard to do so. And so upfront, thinking about how harms can be distributed across communities, not just at the individual level, is an important filter when thinking about the deployment of these systems. Law enforcement is actually in corporate document. There's been some discussion about whether it is or it actually is very strongly in the document. And that's an important factor to keep in mind, because so many of these technologies are being used in law enforcement settings. And again, like I said before, there's a focus on harms and not on technology, and not trying to define AI per se, but think about automation and its impact more broadly. So I'll stop there. Again, I'm thankful for the chance to talk with you all, and I'm looking forward to a discussion.
Thank you so much, Suresh. This was fascinating, and I really enjoyed seeing all of the layers of thought and process that went into formulating these 5 principles. So I would like to call on Nick to kick us off in the discussion and talk a little bit about how we can start digging into some of the thought that went behind the creation of these principles and the challenges that you face in the process.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Suresh, for this wonderful presentation. I very much enjoyed it. I also enjoyed the emphasis that you put on algorithmic discrimination. I think it's such an important part of the whole picture, so I was grateful that you really put a spotlight on there. And this is, I think, where I want to start. Maybe a few reflections, and then I'm mainly interested in asking you a few questions about the thoughts that you and your colleagues put into this document. So the first thing that struck me when I heard you present, but also when I looked at the paper, is that on the one hand, you emphasize that this is about harms specifically and not necessarily about technology. And on the other hand, it still seems that that much of the problem seems to be located with algorithms or with AI, and sort of the social structure dimension of the harms that we see they're not as emphasized. And so I was just wondering, and that's my first sort of prompt, whether you could elaborate a bit on where you really see the problem. Is the problem that some new technology emerged that creates some problems, or is the problem rooted in just social structures? And if it is the latter, meaning if it is the social structures, why are we wrapping all that up into an AI bill? And let's take some very specific examples. So yeah, in the document, you mentioned the body scanners that make you choose between two genders, and thus, I guess, obviously lead to discrimination for people who do not fall into one of those two categories. You mentioned the algorithms that discriminate against female applicants. There are many other anecdotes about an algorithm that apparently only picked or specifically picked people by the name of Jared that played lacrosse. Nice way to showcase the intersectionality of discrimination. And so that would be my first prompt. Sort of, why are we talking about algorithms and not about social structures? Second reflection would be, what do we actually want to compare? So do we want to compare a situation that we presently perceive with algorithmic discrimination with some sort of ideal, or do we compare it to human decision makers with all their flaws, with all their captivity in their social structures? Next prompt, and you can of course pick and choose what you want to react to. Next prompt would be, you mentioned that, and the document mentions an emphasis on robust data and trying to guard against proxies. And that just left me wondering, isn't there just a deeper, more fundamental tension between values of equity, equality, and trying to build systems that predict, that make certain predictions based on the current or based on yesterday's social structures? So take credit assessments as an example. Credit assessments work on based on credit history, on many social factors, and of course, in all those factors, past discrimination is sort of ingrained. And so one way to look at that is to say, well, this algorithm might be correct in predicting that someone who has been discriminated in the past might pose a larger credit risk precisely because that person has been discriminated in the past. And so there seems to be that tension between equality, equity, and accuracy, and a focus on more robust, or if you want, accurate data. I'm not sure whether or how far that gets us. And last prompt, try to keep it as short as possible, is I'm sure you have seen these studies about startups focusing on AI when they're seeking funding, meaning they emphasize the use of AI for one purpose only: to raise funds, to raise supports, one might say. Now, you emphasize that this regulation is really about harms, but it's packaged into sort of AI as a framing. The EU pretty much did the same thing when they passed their AI bill. So should we understand AI as a catalyst for regulation, for broader regulation? That's the last prompt I'll leave you with. And again, thank you so much. I'm very excited about anything that you might pick up from that, but please don't feel obliged to pick up everything.
I wasn't sure if I should wait for all the panelists to comment and then respond, or how would you like me to do it, Mehtab?
I think we can take one panelist's comments at a time.
Okay, I'll try to be quick so we can, So thanks for those comments, Nikolas. These are all very pertinent comments. These are, you will probably find, and for all the panelists, that my answers may be unsatisfactory because you're raising really good questions. And we're trying to navigate real tensions between these points that you're bringing up. So I'll try to prioritize, and I'm just staring at the order. So on the point of tech versus social structures, my answer is going to be it's both, not either. So my view, my personal view here, and what I see is that what we're seeing is existing social structures supercharged and catalyzed in certain directions by technology. So it's not just the tech, it's not just the social structures, it's the interplay between the two. And I use the word socio-technical so often people get annoyed at me, but it's a socio-technical problem that comes from the interplay between fault lines and cracks in society that are then exacerbated by technology. So when you talk about the body scanners, you talk about the algorithms discriminating against female applicants, you're correct that all of these problems could be translated or rendered in a form where there is no technology. That is correct. However, what happens with technology is you start getting things dressed up in very neutral, pseudo-objective scientific language, which prevents us from actually interrogating the problem. B, these problems expand and scale. It's one thing for me as an individual to make a series of decisions about applicants that could be biased. It's another thing to replace me by a system that can do with this at 100,000 times a second and just make the problem one of scale. So it's one of scale, but that makes it much, much, much bigger. So that's another sort of issue. And finally, the fact that these systems can integrate data from multiple sources in ways that humans really cannot do also presents a challenge, because now we actually do not have a context for understanding how these systems are working and where they're getting their information from. So I see this as fundamentally as an interplay between tech and social structures, which is why this is such a challenging sort of transdisciplinary space where you need to understand local societal context. And this is from country to country, this varies, as well as how the technology is being deployed to do this. So I don't think of this as an either or. On the point of, who to compare it with, I think that's also a very good question. In the document, actually, we have language to this effect that if you're going to replace, some previous process with an automated process, you should make sure it at least works better than what the previous process was, right? So I think that's a fair point that, it's not as if human decision makers are all that great. In fact, most of the impetus for replacing or augmenting human decision making by automation is that recognition. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think this is where I am genuinely optimistic that we can do better with technology. But we have to be a lot more thoughtful about it. And I think there is that lack of thoughtfulness and sensitivity is what prompted this sentiment that we should at least make sure we're not doing any worse. The first do no harm principle, I think, applied to tech. On this issue of the tension, I think, again, between equity and accuracy, I will say up front that, we've been motivated from day one by the president's equity directive, the first executive order on equity, which was on day one of his administration. So equity is a priority in the work we do. And, it is definitely our view that the challenges here are challenges of inequity. It is not a trade-off between equity and accuracy. In fact, there's a thriving and robust debate within the technical community about what that even means, because accuracy is often measured with respect to training data, which you got from labeling through some historical process. So the accuracy, and I'm putting scare quotes here, is really what the previous answer said, and not accuracy in some objective ground truth sense. This is where machine learning, I think, is very good at using language that makes things seem a lot more objective than it actually is. And so I don't view this as a trade-off. I think what looks like a trade-off is really an inability to dig deeply into the data. And this encouragement on losing robust data and proxies and on looking at proxies is to say, look very carefully at your data in a way that technologists typically have not done. And that's what the goal of that is. So I'll stop there. I'm eager for more. And thank you, Nikolas, for your questions. These are very, very good questions.
Thank you both. I will move the discussion to Anupam, and I would love to hear your thoughts as well as your perspectives on what the global impact of this blueprint could be.
So, Suresh, this was an incredible description. Your summary was just super helpful and helped me understand the project better as well. And Nick's initial set of questions were brilliant as well. So what a wonderful conversation. I was struck by the references to kind of the international antecedents. So there's a reference to the U.S. FIPS, the Fair Information Practices for privacy principles, and of course the OECD recommendations in this space. And one question that arises for me is this kind of geopolitics of all this. It's very interesting. This document is unlike most documents in this space. So I've read a lot of government documents in this space, including the EU's AI Act, and there's a lot more. You actually contextualize this really well. There's typically a lot more cheerleading about the benefits of AI and a desire to promote innovation that is kind of front and center for governments. Governments are eager to embrace AI. The EU says basically we need to fund a lot of AI across, we need to supercharge AI across the continent. So it's not actually fear of AI, it's we need more AI. Now, of course, their answer is we need more trusted AI, we need more AI that it meets what they describe as European values. And of course, trusted AI is a framework that the US has used as well. But overall, there's also this kind of general specter that China is leading in the, possibly leading in the AI race, and it's got X number of patents, and we're getting, actually we have, I think, more and all those things that, even patent-wise, but fear that those terms may change, those league tables, as we might call them, might change. And so this document comes and says, let's focus on the harms. Let's try to, and it's cast as a Bill of Rights, which is also a really interesting framing. So it actually reminds me strikingly of the one document that it reminds me of is the Brazilian Marco Civil, which is looking at internet regulation from the perspective of the rights holders, the people who are affected by it. In that context, of course, privacy law has that framing as well, but the kind of broad scope of the Marco Civil and kind of civil rights with respect to the internet is a very interesting kind of predecessor in this, and a kind of interesting part of the framing. But another thing that arises in this context is the question about mandatory versus kind of, these aren't exactly guidelines, these are principles, but in some sense guidance for where people might go. Guidance, if an agency wants to choose it, it's not required to, but an agency could pick up these principles, and certainly for the private sector. So I think one of the things that's going to happen in this context is a lot of negative feelings about anything that looks not mandatory, and a feeling that that's actually a kind of antipathy towards more normative statements that don't have legal hammers that follow with their breach. Now, it may be that the normative statements are so broad at this time that it's actually hard to put this into law. The EU has a kind of broad horizontal scope, and I want to talk about the horizontal versus sectoral question as well. But so so there's a lot that I would love to talk about, but I'll just leave it at that. So there's this question about the mandatory nature versus the principles approach, and then I'll let you, if you want, to talk about the kind of horizontal, wide, all automated decision-making versus the kind of, here's a particular industry sector, particular kind of use, hiring, what can be done with AI, or educational settings, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I'll stop there and welcome your thoughts.
Thank you, Anupam. That was fantastic, and I really appreciate these comments. These, again, just like I was saying to Nikolas, these are very important and critical dimensions of tension. And obviously, we've tried to navigate this tension, but we're not, we don't have the answer. So I'll try to illuminate some of the thinking that went into the choices and how we position, right? So I'm glad you find this unlike other documents. That was one of our goals, to not be like every other document in the space. And there have been prior administration statements and actions around AI. The Trump administration had both, was instrumental in, the AI and Government Act was passed during the Trump administration. The Trump administration also put out some EOs around this. So, and that was definitely in the line of, we need to encourage innovation in AI in a trustworthy way. So we felt like those statements had already been made, and we didn't have to keep making them. So that was one thing. I don't think there was no disagreement that. And again, as a computer scientist, I like tech. I actually think it's cool. It's why I'm in the field. And I think we need to do a lot more of it. But I think, and this is, again, very much my personal view, and I don't even know if I have ever shared it in this form with my OSTP colleagues. So with that caveat aside, I feel like a lot of the discussion, especially, with what the EU has been doing around AI and what other entities have been doing, feels a lot like, permit me this rather weird analogy, but it seems to stick in my head. Imagine that for some reason, walking down the streets in DC, there is wide avenues. And this is what I was thinking about this. You have dinosaurs running amok. I just saw Jurassic World Part 3. So dinosaurs are running amok. And the whole discussion is, man, we've got these dinosaurs running amok. We should figure out how to put some, barriers so that when the dinosaurs run amok, they don't destroy too many buildings. Only a few buildings here and there. But for the most part, because it's great with the dinosaurs are running, that's cool. And then someone comes along and says, like, why exactly do you have dinosaurs running the streets? Could we just maybe not have the T-Rexes and not have the Velociraptors and have the cute herbivorous, the small ones running because they're fine, but just say no to the big ones that are going to destroy things? Like, no, we got to have the dinosaurs running. So let's just I feel like all discussion goes along that way, that we have to have the innovation and then we'll have some protection. And then when someone comes and says, well, why? No one has a very good answer to it. And so I think one of the goals, at least my personal orientation when I think about these questions is, can we first talk about who's getting harmed and, whose head the buildings are falling on, and prioritize that rather than, ooh, cool dinosaurs, much as I like dinosaurs. So it's a cartoonish analogy, but I feel very frustrated, I think, with a lot of these discussions around, you must show you're serious by saying that you value innovation. Like, yeah, but we value innovation in many areas. That doesn't stop us from regulating the heck out of them, whether it's drugs, whether it's cars, whether it's planes. We don't just say, yeah, let's put planes up in the air and we shouldn't stop, to regulate planes because, innovation is important. We say, no, we're going to check the heck out of these planes before we let them get up in the air. I don't see a problem here. And I think it's frustrating that more people are not willing to say it. So that's one thing. Your points about mandatory versus guidance, I think some of that is basically constrained by what OSTP as an organization can and cannot do. And I'll be honest there, if I was sitting inside the FTC, I'd be saying something very different. If I was sitting in Congress and, I don't know, Senator Wyden's staff, maybe I'd be saying something very different. But sitting in OSTP in our position as our role as a policy advisor to the president and a coordinator of science and tech policy, our powers are limited in certain ways. We have the ability to convene, we have the ability to coordinate and direct. We have thought leadership in many of these spaces. But we don't have enforcement power. We're not an agency that can actually act. So we work with the entities that can act. And this actually feeds nicely into the issue of horizontal versus vertical, right? A lot of what, work that OSTP does is exactly that, trying to coordinate and manage different sectoral questions around a particular piece of science and tech policy. And AI is no different. As you imagine, AI spans across the board. Every government agency in the US government has some interest in AI in some form. And it's very complex. I mean, the way the Department of Labor might deal with issues with hiring, the way the EEOC might deal with it, the way education thinks about ed tech and how its role in sort of the broader ecosystem of education, how the Department of Justice thinks about it, or DHS, they're quite different. And so on the one hand, we do want some kind of horizontal framing, which is what we're trying to do here. But it has to be sectoral in some sense, because that's how things are structured in the US for the most part. The US is not sort of horizontally driven the way others are. And also because it just makes more sense that way, I think. And that's, I think, where we landed finally saying, that we need, and we were doing this a lot, right? And all our interagency discussion was exactly thinking, okay, how does this broad set of principles apply in this specific context? And does that then inform what we need to say in the document? And so there was a ton of back and forth saying, we wrote something, and an agency would say, well, that doesn't work in our context for this reason. And once we understood, okay, here's a different way to say it that actually does work for everyone. And so there was a lot of back and forth, which is why I was saying this document production was a team effort in that way, because we got a lot of valuable insights from agencies and from the outside, from the public and from industrial partners who actually, so to your point again about voluntary versus mandatory, a lot of our folks would come and tell us in private conversations, we want you to tell us what to do. We don't want to go out on a limb and do it ourselves. Where we want to do something, we'd like to do something, but we'd like some imprimatur coming from somewhere else that we don't have to be the only one doing it. There are a lot of companies who are, I think in the past 1 month, the way things have changed in tech makes me maybe a teeny bit less optimistic right now as to where things are going. But before that, I think companies have been investing a lot in trying to think about how to do more what they call responsible AI development. I don't think that's enough, but I think there is interest in a lot of voluntary efforts as well. And I think, yes, mandatory things are great, force people to do stuff, but it's not the only thing, because if you have to force people to do things, you have to be very specific about what you want them to do. And then you end up in a bit of compliance theater where people will comply with something they're forced to do, which actually takes away from what they should be doing. So this combination of encouraging people to do things in a certain way and with a little bit of a stick to say you should do it is, I think, the ideal solution. And we're trying to do that first part of just sort of laying out what we think people should be doing, encouraging them to think about it.
Wonderful, thank you for that. I'll move the discussion to Art, our third panelist, and after hearing from Art, I think we can combine some audience questions and wrap up the discussion.
Thank you so much, Mehtab. I want to thank Mehtab, Natalie, and Kyoko for heading our conversation today. And I want to say I'm so fortunate that I get front row seats to this wonderful conversation with Suresh, Anupam, Nick, and Mehtab. So I'll try to be brief because I know the audience will be hoping to get some questions in. And I think my first question would be, when you were responding to Nick, you said you were hopeful that we can do better with technology. And I was wondering if, obviously, the AI, the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights is focused on harms, as you've emphasized. But I was wondering if you have a good example of AI that is cognizant of the risks and that avoids harms, that makes you hopeful, that makes you excited about deploying AI, and obviously swathes of sectors to talk about there. My second question would be, you alluded to some frustration about too vague or too broad a conversation before when we are discussing AI, and I think that's something that, if I'm talking about legal scholarship, that's probably the general tone of the conversation. We generally have more broad conversations and discussions about AI. And I was wondering if you could tell us how lawyers could work with technologists and computer scientists in a more concrete way. There was this line in the document which I thought was really striking, where you said that well, I'll quote from it. Relevancy should be established based on research-backed demonstration of the causal influence of the data to the specific use case, or justified more generally based on a reasonable expectation of usefulness in the domain and/or for the system design or ongoing development. This is the part of the document where you're discussing our right to have safe and effective systems deployed. So what I found really striking about this is that the general push towards AI is, well, we're spending all of this money and we don't really know how this works. Let's just deploy AI, and it will be so inexpensive, and you don't really need to understand what's going on, because the AI will recognize patterns and basically move fast and break things. We'll do this more efficiently with AI. We don't need to have social scientists explain to us what's happening here, assuming that this is something that social scientists could give us research into. And I don't know, am I making too much of a point here? This would seem to put the brakes on AI, basically. If you don't know what's going on, it's my reading of this sentence. If you don't know what's going on, maybe, well, you don't have a case for a safe and effective system, automated system. Is that the correct reading I should be making? I do have other two questions, but I'll leave it with just one. I really like how this document makes a point of being sectorally specific, and I was wondering if you could tell us if you think that this regulating AI can be done from a general omnibus strategy, like the EU AI Act is proposing, and is also something that we're seeing in Brazil right now. I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much. Great to be in conversation with you.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, thank you for the questions. They're great. And I have so many things I could say about this. I'll try to be brief. Good examples of positive cases. I'm going to do the academic thing and say that I'm going to answer a different question. The question is not whether there are good use cases and bad use cases. The question is how we make sure that when we use the technology, we get good outcomes versus bad outcomes. And the reason I'm making this distinction is because most of the tech is dual use, right? So there's ways to use it that are bad. There are ways to use it that are less bad. I think there is a thread through a lot of the current discussion around AI and technology that focuses on the tech as the object of study. And I will continue to say this is a mistake. And this goes back to your fourth question about can AI be regulated? I said that's again my point. That's the wrong question. It's not about AI, right? It's about the way in which automation is affecting people. If you're asking questions about technology, you've already lost the battle. You're stuck now in a corner where all your answers are going to be bad answers because you're focusing on the tech. The tech is not the point. The tech plus the impact is the point. And therefore, when you ask about good cases, I'm going to give you good cases. But you're going to be able to say, oh, well, even in that case, there was a problem. And I say, yes, that's the point. So, for example, I think that the use of AI in the physical sciences as a method for discovery has been extremely powerful to actually discover new science, do hypothesis generation, learn things about the universe and the world and about our Earth that we did not know how to do. But why does it work? It works because once scientists do the hypothesis generation using deep learning or ML, they can go actually check it against the actual physics, the actual science about it. So there's a way to cross-check what they're discovering against something else. Same thing is true in cosmology. The same thing is true in medicine, right? There's a lot of opportunity for AI in medicine. There are lots of problems as well, but there are opportunities because, again, you can think of using automation as part of a broader process of discovery, where there are other ways to cross-check the hypotheses and the questions that AI is suggesting might be interesting. I did my PhD a long time ago, looking at essentially what we now call drug discovery, where we were trying to see whether automation could be used to generate hypotheses for drug candidates. No one was going to take those hypotheses and put them into someone's body. They were going to do actual tests on them to see. And the point of automation was to generate viable hypotheses that may not have been possible to do for us. That's great, as long as you do the checks. And so that's what I mean. All of these technologies are great, but you have to put them within the appropriate sandbox, safe framework to do them. on this issue you described about, the things we're recommending people do would just slow down the way AI is being developed. I think you answered your own question, right? Why on earth should we be deploying something if we have no idea how it works? That just seems insane to me. And yet we do it every day. And when I tell people this is what happens, they say, there's no way you could be just deploying stuff without checking it. I'm like, yes, that's exactly what's happening. And so my constant reaction is one of frustration. Like, yes, we are actually doing things in a completely clueless way without knowing what we're doing. And we're just praying to the AI gods to save things for us. That is nuts. Why are we doing this? And yet we keep doing it. So yes, I do want to slow things down. I do want to put a brakes on it. I do think we should be thinking a little bit more, getting some actual insight on data into this thing. Otherwise, what is justification do we have to harm people based on the AI gods will save us? That doesn't make any sense to me. You talked about how lawyers can work. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I work with lawyers. I write papers with law prof colleagues. I've spent, of course, in the White House. I was surrounded by lawyers all the time. It's challenging. I think it's challenging because we have very different disciplinary perspectives. Technologists do and lawyers do. There's a lack of education on each other's side. CS people are not trained in policy and law. Lawyers often, not generally, but often don't have the same kind of mathematical technical background. And so it's difficult also to understand some of these more subtle technical issues of communication and goals. I've spent a lot of my life in interdisciplinary spaces. So, I have some facility with understanding where the pressure points are and it's not just about jargon, it's also about what are the broader goals and what are we trying to do? And I think once you're able to articulate, okay, as a technologist, this is what I'm trying to do, this is what animates me, and this is why I ask questions. And you can understand from the legal side, okay, this is what animates me, and this is why I ask these questions. Then the conversation actually starts becoming quite fruitful. And I think in the tech law world, when you go to PLSC or you go to WIII, there's a lot of people who are crossing the fence all the time. So I'm very hopeful about that, actually. I think there's a lot of conversations going on and a lot of sophistication on both sides of the aisle, if you wish, from the technology side and from the law side about each other's disciplines. So I think that's going well.
Thank you for your questions, Art and Suresh, for elaborating on what the process is like. I'm always interested in seeing how interdisciplinary collaborations work, and I also work with a lot of computer scientists, so it's always a challenge to translate concepts. We'd like to move to the audience because we'd love to hear questions and comments from them. We have one question right now, and we have maybe room for 3 or 4 more questions if people are interested. We can go a little bit over, and I'm happy to combine questions also. So we have one question from Michael Frumkin, who says that, is there any prospect of an executive order telling agencies to regulate consistently with all or part of the AI Bill of Rights? So
this issue has been discussed. Again, I won't maybe get into too many specifics on this, but this definitely what came up in consideration. Another thing that was in consideration was, and that's been ongoing, and after I left, I'm sure it's been going on as well, is trying to incorporate guidance from the blueprint into the requirements for agencies under the previous administration's EO 13960 on sort of the use of AI in government practices. So there's been a lot of cross discussion and collaboration amongst the teams that have been coordinating the implementation of EO 13960, as well as the teams that have been working on the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. So that's a couple of vehicles like that, as well as close working with agencies as they develop their own frameworks, their own enforcement regulatory frameworks, to make sure that they have components from the blueprint in what they're doing. So yes, things like that have been discussed, and I'm sure are continuing to be discussed.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? We're open to take some questions in the next few minutes, but I also had a question. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how your work has been in parallel or in combination with some of the legislative proposals that have been coming out, such as the Algorithmic Accountability Act, the Platform Transparency Act. And you earlier spoke about how these AI Bill of Rights actually will have a lot of impact on civil rights, privacy, access to resources. So what are those conversations like, and how have you found them productive or where do you see the collaborations coming in?
So we were tracking many of these proposals, both the Algorithm Accountability Act, the stuff that was happening, for example, in New York, and the Stop Discrimination by Algorithms Act in Washington, D.C., and the proposals in Washington State. So we were reading all of those proposals and trying to understand how they were approaching the question. I think they definitely informed our thinking. I think our goal was. We still felt that there was a need for something that could, again, clearly articulate both where the harms were and what the kinds of protections needed were, with the hope that this would then inform legislative proposals. I think a lot of the legislative proposals were very good, and we had very good ideas on process, on things like how to do impact assessments, how to do auditing, and that's great. I think the expectation sections, for example, of the blueprint, were very much in line with that. But the principles themselves are things we felt were important to articulate so that they could then guide the kinds of process controls that would be put in place through legislation as well. I see a couple of other questions. I can go through them from the chat if you'd like me to.
Yes, I think that the first question is related to what I asked.
Yeah.
What response?
So the funny thing is that, and this is the thing that saddens me a little bit, I had to come back to Brown in August. And so, most of the engagement with Congress was probably happening after the release. So I'm actually not privy to what discussions have been having there. I'm sure there were many, and I've seen some of the more public statements, very strong supportive statements coming out of Congress from the chair of the House Science Committee, for example, and from others who've been working in the space. So I'm pretty sure discussions are ongoing, and I hope they are. But I know we had planned on having outreach when things got closer, and so I'm sure they were doing that.
Okay, so we have a question on the EU recognizing different roles for companies in the AI supply chain, and how do you allocate responsibilities between such entities? And has the OSTP focused on that distinction? How do you allocate regulatory duties for such providers? Because there's different entities involved in different stages.
Yeah. This is challenging, and you're right, because the supply chain can get very complicated. I think because of our focus on impact, I think, and I don't know if this is explicitly in the document, or it's at least implicitly, we were always thinking of, the entities closest to the point of impact, right? So if I'm, for example, a government agency procuring software that I'm going to be using to decide, to identify people who should be getting some kind of benefits, then this document is written for me, right? I should be making sure these things, and if it means that I have to go and ask the third party about their software and make sure that they are doing this, then that's what has to happen. And so that was also a vehicle of change, right? So that government procurement is one way to sort of enforce, if not enforce, but sort of shape changes in how technology is developed. And so at least our thinking was around that point of impact. But I think that's implicit. I don't think that was explicitly laid out in the document. But it's a very good question.
And I think it also ties into some of the, the practical proposals related to AI regulation, which is auditing and documenting and creating requirements for reporting. And I feel like this represents a whole ecosystem of how you start thinking about it and then how you implement it. Yeah. Do we have any other last questions? The panelists should also feel free to jump in here before we wrap up. If there aren't any other questions, and we also want to be mindful of everybody's time. Thank you so much, Suresh. This was an illuminating discussion. I have been curious about the AI Bill of Rights ever since it was first announced, and I really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you to our panelists for these insightful comments. I will leave it to Kyoko to wrap up and tell us about the next event.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the Wikimedia at the Yale Information Society Project, the Georgetown Institute for Technology, Law and Policy, and the Georgetown Global Technet Working Group, I would like to thank Professor Suresh Venkatasubramanian for taking his time out of his busy schedule to speak to us about the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And thank you to all the speakers for the wonderful comments. The video of today's panel will be uploaded at the Yale ISB's AI governance website along with a summary. Our next panel is on the AI initiatives in Brazil, scheduled in late January or early February. So please check the event page for more information. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for joining us from around the globe. Have a great day or evening. Thank you.